Imagine being locked in a cell so cold, so isolating that the sound of laughter drifting through a window became a form of psychological torture. That was life on the rock, and today we're going inside. If you're into history that actually gets under your skin, hit subscribe. We're trying to reach 100 subscribers. There's this image most people carry around in their heads when they think of Alcatraz, a dramatic island prison rising from the fog of San Francisco Bay. Clint Eastwood crawling through a ventilation shaft. Maybe a black and white mugshot of Al Capone staring back at you from a museum pamphlet. It all feels very cinematic, very distant, like something out of a story that couldn't possibly have been as bad as they say. It was worse. Not in the Hollywood sense of secret dungeons and medieval torture devices, though we'll get to something that came surprisingly close, but in a quieter, more insidious way. The real horror of Alcatraz wasn't the violence. It was the routine. It was the silence. It was the architecture of a place specifically designed to strip a human being down to almost nothing, day after day, year after year, with almost mathematical precision. Today, we're going inside that routine. What did a Tuesday actually look like for an inmate on Alcatraz? What did they eat? What could they hear? What happened if they broke a rule? And how did something as ordinary as an open window become one of the most psychologically devastating features of the entire prison? But before we go any further, if you enjoy history that goes beyond the textbook, consider subscribing to this channel. We're on a mission to reach 100 subscribers, and every single one of you makes a huge difference. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey through history. The island itself. Let's start with the geography, because the geography is the first punishment. Alcatraz sits about 1.5 miles from the San Francisco waterfront. Close enough that, on a clear day, you could see the city skyline from certain angles of the island. Close enough to hear foghorns. Close enough, on still nights, to catch fragments of music from New Year's Eve celebrations across the bay. Far enough that the water between the island and the mainland, cold, dark, fed by powerful currents, made escape essentially a death sentence. The Bureau of Prisons opened Alcatraz as a federal penitentiary in 1934, and from day one, its stated purpose was unlike any other prison in America. It wasn't meant to rehabilitate. It wasn't even really meant to punish in the traditional sense. Alcatraz existed as a warehouse, a place to send the men that other prisons couldn't handle, the escape risks, the ringleaders, the men who had turned other institutions into chaos. You only came to Alcatraz if you had already proven somewhere else that you were ungovernable, which meant the rulebook had to be airtight. The 4 privileges. When you arrived at Alcatraz, a guard would explain 4 things you were entitled to: food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. That was the list. Everything else, absolutely everything, was a privilege you had to earn. Talking to other inmates, using the library, playing in the recreation yard, writing letters home. All of it conditional, all of it revocable. This wasn't just prison policy, it was a philosophy. The idea was simple and brutal. Take away everything, then slowly give pieces of it back in exchange for compliance. Your entire existence on that island would be oriented around not losing what little you'd managed to accumulate. And that system worked, in its cold and mechanical way, precisely because of what the inmates could hear. The sound of San Francisco. Here's the thing that almost nobody outside Alcatraz knew, and almost nobody inside Alcatraz could stop thinking about. The prison's cell house sat at the top of the island, and its windows, long, industrial, built for ventilation, faced the bay. On weekends, especially during summer, sounds drifted across the water from the city, music from bars, fireworks on holidays, the noise of a baseball game broadcast playing from someone's radio on a boat, the distant shouts of people having a good time. Imagine you're 3 years into a sentence. You haven't had a real conversation in weeks because talking in the cell house was heavily restricted. You haven't seen your family in months. Your entire world is a 5 by 9 foot cell, a narrow corridor, a cafeteria, and a concrete yard. And then, on a Saturday evening, you hear laughter. Real, uncomplicated human laughter. Floating across the water from a city you can almost see but will never touch. Former inmates described this as one of the most psychologically destabilizing parts of their incarceration. It wasn't designed as torture. Nobody sat in an office and thought, let's make sure they can hear the jazz clubs. It was just geography. But the effect was the same. The proximity to normal life, without any access to it, created a particular kind of anguish that walls alone never could. A day in the life. The daily routine at Alcatraz was rigid in the way that a military drill is rigid. Every hour scheduled, every movement accounted for. Inmates were counted no fewer than 13 times per day. 13. Guards walked through with clipboards at intervals throughout the night, shining flashlights into cells to confirm that a body was present and breathing. Wake up was at 6:30 in the morning. You had 20 minutes to get dressed and clean your cell before the morning count. Then you walked in silence to the cafeteria, where you had exactly 20 minutes to eat. The food at Alcatraz was, by the standards of the American prison system, actually quite good. Caloric, varied, sometimes including fresh vegetables and decent cuts of meat. This was intentional. A hungry inmate is an angry inmate. A well-fed inmate has one less reason to riot. After breakfast, work assignments. Most inmates spent their days in the industrial laundry, the tailor shop, the glove factory, or the kitchen. The work wasn't hard labor in the chain gang sense. It was repetitive, indoor, mind-numbing work designed to fill hours without providing any stimulation. You could spend years pressing the same seam into the same type of military uniform without ever feeling like time was actually passing. The rules of silence. In the early years of Alcatraz, roughly 1934 to 1937, the prison operated under something called the silence rule. Inmates were not permitted to speak to one another except during their limited recreation time. Not in the corridors, not in the cafeteria, not in the work areas. Complete silence, enforced by guards who carried the kind of authority that came with absolute institutional backing. The silence rule was eventually relaxed because it turned out that prolonged enforced silence doesn't make people more compliant. It makes them more unstable. But even after the formal rule was lifted, conversation remained tightly controlled. You spoke when permitted. You spoke quietly. You did not shout, argue, or draw attention to yourself unless you wanted to find out what happened to people who drew attention to themselves. What happened was the whole. D Block and the treatment cell. At the far end of the cell house sat D Block, officially called the treatment unit, which was either a deeply ironic name or a deeply cynical one, depending on your perspective. D Block was where inmates went when they violated the rules, fighting, attempting escape, refusing orders, or simply being deemed too disruptive for general population. D Block had several levels of isolation. The least severe still meant spending most of your day locked in your cell with no work assignment and no yard time. The most severe, the cell's inmates called the hole, was something else entirely. The hole consisted of a completely dark cell. No light, no mattress during the day, a toilet, a sink, a concrete floor. You slept on a thin mat that was slid under the door at night and taken away in the morning. Your meals were passed through a slot. You had no way of knowing whether it was day or night. You had no reading material, no human contact, no sound except the ambient noise of the building. Men came out of the hole changed. Some came out quieter. Some came out with a kind of distant look that never fully went away. Robert Birdman Stroud, one of Alcatraz's most famous inmates, though ironically he never kept birds there, that was at his previous prison, spent years in isolation. He wrote about the experience in terms that make your chest tighten, the absence of time, the way your mind starts filling silence with its own noise. Robert Stroud and the Weight of Years Stroud is worth pausing on, because his story captures something essential about what long-term incarceration at Alcatraz actually did to a person. He arrived there in 1942 after 17 years of solitary confinement at Leavenworth. He was already institutionalized in the deepest sense of the word, a man whose entire inner world had contracted to the dimensions of a cell. At Alcatraz, he spent 11 more years. He wrote, he studied, he petitioned for release for decades and was denied, repeatedly, long after any reasonable justification for his continued imprisonment had evaporated. He died in prison in 1963, the same year Alcatraz finally closed, having spent over 54 years incarcerated. The last meaningful memory many of those men had of the outside world was from a different era entirely. The recreation yard. On weekends, inmates were allowed into the recreation yard, a concrete enclosure on the south side of the island, open to the sky and, crucially, open to the view of San Francisco. The yard was where most of the social life of the prison happened. Card games, baseball, if you could organize enough players. Conversations conducted in low voices near the walls where the guards had less direct sight lines. It was also where you could see the Golden Gate Bridge completed in 1937, just a few years after the federal prison opened. There is something almost unbearably cinematic about that image, a structure that became one of the great symbols of freedom and movement in American history, visible from a yard where men were serving time with almost no possibility of early release. Some inmates said the view kept them sane, a reminder that the world was still out there, still moving. Some inmates said the view made it worse, a reminder that the world was still out there, still moving, without them. The closure and the legacy Alcatraz closed in 1963, partly because it was extraordinarily expensive to operate. Everything, including fresh water, had to be brought to the island by boat, and partly because the new philosophy of American corrections was, at least officially, shifting toward rehabilitation. The prison had never really fit the spirit of that idea. Today, the island is a national park. Tourists walk those same corridors. They stand in the cells, most of them visibly surprised by how small 5 by 9 feet actually feels. They look out those long industrial windows toward the San Francisco skyline and hear, if they're there on a clear day, the sound of the city drifting across the water. And for just a moment, just a brief involuntary moment, they understand what it meant to hear that sound and be unable to move toward it. That's the real legacy of Alcatraz. Not the escape attempts, not the famous inmates. The legacy is a very specific kind of silence, punctuated by the sounds of everything you'd lost. And that's the story that most people never hear about Alcatraz. Not the escapes, not the gangsters, but the quiet, grinding psychological weight of a place designed to make the world feel just out of reach. If this kind of history resonates with you, the kind that goes beneath the surface and actually explores what it felt like to live through something, I'd genuinely love for you to subscribe to this channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and each one of you is how this keeps going. Drop a comment below telling me what surprised you most about life inside Alcatraz, or whether you think a place like this could ever really be justified. I read every single comment. See you in the next one.